What if the most advanced food storage technology available to you right now was invented 10,000 years ago, costs almost nothing to run, and your great-grandparents knew exactly how to build it, but you don't? Across rural North America and much of Europe before 1900, a root cellar was as ordinary as a chimney or a front door. Farm inventories from New England, Pennsylvania, and the Upper South list a root cellar in 87% of surveyed properties between 1845 and 1880. These were not afterthoughts or rustic add-ons. They were engineered, purpose-built chambers, dug 4 to 8 feet below ground, lined with stone or timber and fitted with vent holes to manage air and moisture. Estate records and probate documents from colonial Pennsylvania and Virginia show that up to 90% of a family's winter produce, potatoes, carrots, apples, onions, cabbages, was stored in these cellars, shielded from frost and rot for months at a time. Construction manuals and agricultural handbooks from the 19th century treated the cellar as basic infrastructure, detailing everything from drainage trenches to lime-plastered walls. The daily rhythm of life revolved around these hidden rooms. Families hauled baskets up narrow steps, checked for mold or sprouting, and adjusted vents to keep the air just right. Even in regions with harsh winters, the ground's steady temperature kept food safe without a single watt of electricity. This was not a fringe tradition or a relic of poverty. In the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the German-speaking Alps, farmhouses were expected to include a root cellar as standard practice. The design details, depth, ventilation, humidity control, were refined over generations precisely because a failed cellar meant spoiled food and hungry months ahead. Yet within a single lifetime, this backbone of household resilience faded almost entirely from daily life, leaving behind little more than half-remembered stories and stone-lined holes in the ground. By the early 20th century, the momentum behind mechanical refrigeration was already unmistakable. Appliance manufacturers eager to expand their market poured resources into advertising campaigns that painted root cellars as backward and unsanitary. Between 1920 and 1940, more than 4 million refrigerators were shipped across the United States, with ownership climbing from a rarity to a household norm within a generation. Trade journals from the period are filled with images of gleaming kitchen appliances promising convenience and health, while quietly erasing the idea of underground storage from the modern home. Federal policy amplified this shift. The Federal Housing Administration design standards from 1949 classified underground storage as non-essential, even warning that cellars could pose sanitation risks. New model homes promoted in magazines and at suburban developments featured slab-on-grade foundations and no provision for below-grade storage. At the same time, the Rural Electrification Administration extended power lines across the countryside, making electric refrigeration accessible to millions of farm families by the mid-1950s. Federal Housing Administration guidance documents and extension bulletins from the era discouraged cellar construction, arguing that refrigerators provided a cleaner, pest-free environment, a claim echoed in appliance ads that lingered on the supposed dangers of damp, dark cellars. By the late 1950s, the convergence of industry lobbying, government policy, and a relentless marketing narrative had rewritten the blueprint for American homes. The root cellar, once a basic element of survival, became a symbol of obsolescence. It was cast aside not by accident, but by design. The legacy of this transformation is a food system deeply dependent on continuous electricity and just-in-time delivery, with little room for error or memory of what came before. Today, the food supply chain that replaced root cellars is built on a razor's edge. The average American grocery store stocks only about 3 days' worth of inventory on its shelves. That is not a figure from a worst-case scenario, but the day-to-day reality of just-in-time logistics. Every apple, potato, and bag of carrots is kept fresh by a cold chain, a seamless network of refrigerated trucks, warehouses, and store coolers that depends on constant electricity and uninterrupted deliveries. When that chain breaks, the consequences are immediate. During Hurricane Ida in 2021, power outages in Louisiana lasted for up to 10 days in some neighborhoods. Refrigerated sections in supermarkets and corner stores turned into rows of spoiled food with entire inventories dumped in dumpsters behind the buildings. For thousands of households, the sudden loss of cold storage meant that everything from milk to produce to insulin became unusable overnight. FEMA's after-action reports document not just the scale of food loss, but the scramble for emergency supplies as families found themselves cut off from fresh food in a matter of hours. The 3-day inventory is not a hidden vulnerability. It is a design feature of a system optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Unlike the root cellars that once buffered months of harvest against weather and uncertainty, today's infrastructure offers no fallback. If the trucks stop, if the grid goes down, the shelf is bare. This is the modern cliff, a sharp drop from apparent abundance to scarcity, with no passive storage to soften the fall. The loss of root cellars is not just a historical curiosity, it is a missing layer of security that most households do not realize is gone until it is too late. Beneath just 4 feet of soil, the ground holds a steady temperature between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season above. This is no accident of folklore, but the result of the Earth's high thermal mass, which shields against daily and seasonal swings. Peer-reviewed studies confirm that at cellar depth, the temperature band remains stable, winter or summer. Humidity underground is just as important. Air in a cellar typically sits between 85 and 95% relative humidity, a range that keeps root crops crisp and slows the loss of moisture that plagues produce in modern refrigerators. Instead of mechanical cooling, a cellar relies on the natural moisture of the soil and simple venting. The energy savings are striking. A major review in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews reports that earth-sheltered structures can cut heating and cooling energy by up to 80%. Penn State extension trials found apples stored in cellars kept 12% more phenolic compounds, important antioxidants, than those in walk-in fridges. Carrots, onions, and potatoes held over 90% of their vitamin C compared to 75% in conventional cold storage. Across the Northern Hemisphere, underground food storage was not an isolated quirk, but a convergent solution adopted by cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history. In the alpine valleys of Switzerland and Austria, cadastral records from the 1860s list Kellerion, stone-lined cellars carved into hillsides on nearly every farmstead, their cool interiors safeguarding cheese, apples, and root crops through brutal winters. In Sweden, the Jordkällare, arched, earth-covered chambers remained a fixture well into the 20th century and were with ethnographic studies documenting their use among both rural families and urban gardeners. On the Canadian prairies and the Great Plains, indigenous communities engineered earth fridges, pits lined with willow, moss, or stone, designed to keep dried meat, berries, and tubers safe from both heat and predators. Even in regions with wildly different climates, the principle was the same: use the Earth's steady coolness to buffer against the chaos above. This pattern repeats in Korea, where kimchi jars are buried, to maintain the precise temperature and humidity needed for fermentation, and in Iceland, where turf houses with subfloor pantries preserve dairy and fish. The consistency of these practices, documented in cadastral maps, oral histories, and archaeological surveys, reveals a universal human logic. When food security is on the line, cultures turn to the ground itself. The disappearance of root cellars in one country is not progress, but a break from a shared lineage of resilience. Interest in root cellars has soared, with searches for how to build a root cellar up 300% since 2019. Homeowners and small farmers are comparing the upfront costs of underground storage to the ongoing expense of refrigeration. Building a new root cellar typically costs between $5,300 and $12,000, covering excavation, masonry, and weatherproofing. Prefabricated kits from companies like Earthstore and Rooted Designs range from $4,500 to $7,000, about the same as a high-end refrigerator, but with no monthly energy bill. The difference in energy use is striking. A standard refrigerator uses about 35 gigajoules of embodied energy over its life, while a root cellar requires just 0.5 gigajoules to build and almost nothing to run. Households with cellars report up to a 30% drop in freezer use, a finding backed by pilot studies in the Pacific Northwest. But legal hurdles remain. Many towns still treat root cellars as basements, triggering expensive code requirements. Burlington, Vermont has responded with passive food storage overlays, exempting cellars that meet certain thermal standards. In Appalachia, a mechanical engineer and his partner retrofitted a beehive cellar, cutting freezer use by 1/3 and keeping produce fresh through winter. No power, no spoilage. Our entire food supply now depends on just 3 days of grocery inventory and a constant flow of electricity. Root cellars weren't a quirky tradition. They were resilient infrastructure abandoned for profit. As power grids strain and supply chains falter, the question isn't nostalgia. It is survival. What would you rebuild?